Hey guys, tonight we begin with something brutal yet essential. What you should do when the world is going to shit, but not as you imagine. Nothing about grand heroic gestures or revolutionary manifestos. This time, you'll be just you. An ordinary person living amidst collapsing systems and uncertain futures. So, before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe if this truly speaks to you. Now, adjust your light, take a deep breath, and let's navigate the chaos together. You wake to the muted glow of your phone screen, thumb scrolling, almost by muscle memory through another cascade of catastrophes. Climate disasters unfolding in real time, political systems crumbling, economic uncertainties mounting like dark clouds on the horizon. The weight of it all settles into your chest, that familiar heaviness that makes you wonder if getting out of bed is even worth the effort. There's a peculiar comfort in the hopelessness sometimes, isn't there? A strange permission to surrender, to pull the covers back over your head and disappear into the warm darkness where responsibility feels optional. But something pulls at you today. A quiet revelation forming in the back of your mind as you stare at the ceiling. The realization that perhaps your smallness in this vast, troubled world isn't a curse, but something else entirely. The morning light filters through your curtains, painting patterns across your floor that shift and change with each passing moment, much like the world outside. You've heard it all before, the grand solutions, the sweeping changes needed, the revolutionary actions required to save everything from collapse. But those massive shifts feel so far removed from your everyday reality, don't they? The space between what you can actually do and what needs to be done stretches like an unbridgeable chasm. Yet in that quiet morning moment, watching dust particles dance in the sunbeam, you begin to understand something profound about chaos and control. The truth emerges slowly when the world is falling apart. The first revolutionary act is simply to continue, to rise, to breathe, to move forward with intention, even when intention feels like the most fragile thing in existence. Your feet touch the cool floor, and you feel the solid ground beneath you. Such a simple thing that we take for granted until earthquakes, both literal and metaphorical, remind us how tenuous stability can be. You move toward the window and open it slightly, letting in the sounds of the morning. A distant car horn, birds conversing in languages you'll never understand, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The world continues its rotation, indifferent to its own unraveling. There's something strangely comforting in that indifference, isn't there? A reminder that beyond human systems and constructs, beyond economies and governments, there exists a deeper order that continues regardless. You breathe it in, this knowledge settling into your bones like an ancient wisdom. When everything is chaos, finding your center isn't escapism. It's the foundation of meaningful action. You move through your morning with deliberate slowness, transforming routine into ritual. The careful measuring of coffee grounds, the methodical folding of your bedsheets, the mindful arrangement of items on your desk, these aren't distractions from the world's problems, but tiny assertions of order in a disordered universe. Each small act of intention becomes a quiet rebellion against the helplessness that threatens to engulf you. You begin to recognize that in times of overwhelming chaos, maintaining daily rituals isn't just self-care, it's a political statement, a declaration that even as systems collapse, you refuse to surrender the rhythms that make you human. The steam rises from your coffee cup, curling in unpredictable patterns before disappearing, a reminder that some things can be both temporary and perfect. Your phone buzzes with another notification, another crisis unfolding halfway across the world, or perhaps just down the street. The temptation rises to dive back into that stream of information, to drown in the endless cycle of reaction and outrage that masquerades as engagement. But today, you pause before reaching for it. You consider, perhaps for the first time, the difference between being informed and being consumed, between witnessing the world and allowing it to devour your capacity for meaningful response. The ritual of your morning has created a small pocket of clarity, a momentary shelter from which you can observe without immediately reacting. This space between stimulus and response. This is where your power has been hiding all along, waiting for you to notice. Outside your window, you spot something unexpected in the small patch of earth beside your building. A stubborn plant pushing through concrete, green and vital against the urban grey. You've passed it 100 times without noticing, but today it stops you in your tracks. There's a metaphor here, obvious perhaps, but no less powerful for its simplicity. Life persisting despite unfavorable conditions, growth occurring in the most unlikely places. You find yourself drawn to this small miracle, kneeling to examine the delicate leaves reaching towards sunlight with unapologetic determination. And in this moment of connection with something so easily overlooked, you feel the first stirrings of a different approach to a world in crisis. Later, you decide to tend to this unexpected garden. It's not planned or strategic, just a spontaneous response to something that moved you. You clear away some debris, add a little water from your bottle, create a small protective barrier from carelessly trampling feet. The action is minuscule in the grand scheme of global catastrophes, practically invisible in the metrics of meaningful change. And yet, as your fingers touch the soil, as you arrange a few stones in a circle around the emerging plant, something shifts in your perception. You are, in this moment, neither savior nor victim of the world's chaos. You are simply a participant in life's stubborn persistence. There's a power in this participation that feels entirely different from the frantic powerlessness of scrolling through disaster headlines or the paralyzing enormity of systemic problems. As you walk to work or to run errands, you carry this small experience with you, viewing your surroundings through slightly altered eyes. The world is still unraveling in all the ways that filled your morning news feed, but alongside that unraveling, you now notice countless small acts of mending. The neighbor who always places fresh water out for stray animals, the bus driver who knows every regular passenger by name, the community garden wedged between abandoned buildings, the mutual aid network operating out of the local coffee shop. These things have always been there, operating alongside the collapse, but your attention had been so thoroughly captured by the spectacle of destruction that these quiet acts of creation had become invisible. You begin to understand that when the world is going to shit, one of the most radical things you can do is to shift your attention deliberately toward what is being built rather than only what is being destroyed. Not as denial or toxic positivity, but as a strategic reallocation of your most precious resource, your focused awareness. Because what you consistently attend to shapes what you perceive as possible, and what you perceive as possible ultimately determines what you can create. This isn't about ignoring the reality of systems collapsing. It's about simultaneously holding space for the emergence that always accompanies dissolution, if only we have eyes to see it. At lunch, you sit alone at your usual spot, but something compels you to make eye contact and smile at the person who always occupies the table near yours, a small gesture barely requiring effort. To your surprise, they come over and introduce themselves. The conversation that follows is nothing extraordinary: weather, work complaints, a recommendation for a nearby restaurant. But beneath the mundane exchange lies something profound. A connection formed, a tiny bridge built across the isolation that so often accompanies societal distress. You realize how long it's been since you had a conversation with a stranger that wasn't mediated through a screen or colored by shared outrage at the state of things. This brief human connection leaves a residue of warmth that stays with you throughout the afternoon. It reminds you of something essential that's easily forgotten when systems are failing. The fundamental unit of all human systems is relationship. Governments can collapse, economies can falter, institutions can betray our trust, but the capacity for two humans to connect, to see and be seen by one another remains indestructible. When the world is going to shit, perhaps the most necessary response is not to retreat into individual survival mode, but to strengthen the intricate web of relationships that has always been civilization's true infrastructure. The afternoon unfolds, with its usual demands and frustrations, but you find yourself approaching each interaction differently, more present, more curious about the human being behind each transaction or email exchange. You notice how this slight shift in your approach creates ripples. A tense customer service interaction transforms into a moment of mutual understanding. A dismissive colleague reveals a personal struggle when met with genuine inquiry, rather than defensive reaction. None of these exchanges will make headlines or reverse climate change or topple corrupt power structures, and yet they feel far from insignificant. They feel like practice for the kind of world that might emerge from the compost of our collapsing systems. As evening approaches, you pass a community center with a hand-painted sign announcing a neighborhood meeting about local food security initiatives. On any other day, you might have walked past without a second glance, too exhausted by the world's problems to engage with potential solutions, especially ones operating at such a modest scale. But today, influenced by the subtle shifts in your perception, you find yourself pushing open the door and taking a seat in the back row. The room is half empty, the presentation amateur, the proposed projects modest in scope. And yet, watching the passionate presenter explain their vision for urban gardens and skill-sharing networks, you feel something unexpected stirring within you. Not the desperate hope that precedes disappointment, but something more grounded and enduring. You listen as neighbors debate the practicalities of composting systems and rainwater collection, as they negotiate the use of shared spaces and resources, as they problem solve with the kind of pragmatic creativity that emerges when people are motivated by genuine need rather than abstract ideology. There's something powerful happening in this unremarkable room with its folding chairs and fluorescent lighting, something that existed long before the current cascading crises and will likely survive whatever comes next. You're witnessing the forgotten community, the resilient network of human relationships that has always been the true foundation of civilization, the thing that persists when more formalized systems falter or fail. As the meeting ends, you find yourself volunteering to help with a small aspect of the project. Nothing heroic or all-consuming, just a specific contribution that aligns with your skills and available time. The commitment feels different from the periodic donations you make to large-scale causes or the online petitions you occasionally sign. It feels tangible, rooted in your actual community, connected to faces and names rather than abstract concepts of change. You exchange contact information with a few others who live surprisingly close to you. Neighbors whose existence you had never previously acknowledged beyond the most cursory nod in passing. Walking home in the gathering dusk, you reflect on the day's subtle but significant shift.
Nothing in the external world has changed. The same crises still loom. The same systems continue their decline. The same challenging future awaits. And yet something in your relationship to it all has transformed. You've discovered, or perhaps
remembered, that meaningful response to a world in crisis doesn't necessarily begin with grand gestures or perfect solutions. It begins with presence, with attention, with the courage to remain engaged without becoming engulfed, with the willingness to act at the scale available to you without dismissing that action as insignificant. As darkness settles fully around, you, the stars becoming visible between city buildings, you feel neither the crushing despair of earlier mornings nor the naive optimism that denies reality. Instead, you experience something more nuanced and sustaining, a grounded hope that acknowledges both the gravity of what's being lost and the possibility of what might yet be created. You understand now that when the world is going to shit, your response need not be limited to either frantic action or helpless surrender. There exists a third path, the mindful cultivation of what you wish to preserve and grow, beginning exactly where you are, with exactly what you have. You arrive home and prepare for sleep, moving through your evening routine with the same deliberate presence that characterized your morning. As you settle into bed, your phone tempts you with its endless scroll of catastrophes and commentaries, but tonight you place it aside, choosing instead to end your day by writing down 3 specific actions, modest in scale but clear in intention, that you'll take tomorrow, not to save the world but to participate more fully in both its unraveling and its reweaving. As your consciousness begins to drift towards sleep, you hold this paradox gently, that in a world coming undone, the most revolutionary act might be to deliberately create small moments of wholeness. That when everything is falling apart, there is profound power in steadfastly putting things together. You wake in the middle of the night, that liminal hour when the world grows quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. The darkness around you feels both intimate and vast, like being wrapped in the universe's deepest questions. This midnight awakening, once dreaded as lost sleep, now reveals itself as a hidden doorway, a passage into clarity that daylight, with all its demands and distractions, rarely permits. You lie there, eyes open to the darkness, and allow the fears that have been chasing you to finally catch up. The economy's uncertain future, the political divisions tearing at society's fabric, the environmental tipping points approaching with terrifying momentum. In daylight, these fears appear as an endless scroll of news alerts and social media debates. But here, in the midnight quiet, they transform into something more honest, a profound grief for what is being lost, a deep anxiety about what remains.
Uncertain. The strange gift of this midnight hour is that it strips away pretense. There are no audiences here, no performances of either panic or poise, just you and the darkness and the unvarnished truth of your own vulnerability in a world
that offers no guarantees. You breathe into this awareness, noticing how your chest rises and falls despite everything, how your heart continues its faithful rhythm without requiring your conscious command. Your body knows something your anxious mind often forgets, that life persists through uncertainty, that humanity has navigated collapse and renewal countless times before you were born. This knowledge doesn't diminish the legitimate concerns about what's unfolding in your particular historical moment, but it does place them within a larger context that somehow makes them more bearable as your eyes adjust to the darkness. The familiar shapes of your room gradually emerge from the shadows. The chair where you toss clothes at day's end, the bookshelf with its patient rows of stories and ideas, the window framing a sky that has witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. There's something strangely comforting about this gradual revelation of what was there all along, unseen but present. It reminds you that perception shapes reality far more than we acknowledge, that what we focus on determines not just what we see, but what we're capable of creating. In a world that profits from your panic and rewards constant crisis, the simple act of directing your attention deliberately rather than surrendering it to algorithms becomes a quiet rebellion. You rise from bed, moving softly through your darkened home to the window. The night sky stretches above, stars puncturing the darkness with ancient light that began its journey toward your eyes, long before any of today's crises emerged. You consider how many human generations have stood at windows like this, gazing up at these same stars while facing their own versions of an uncertain future. There's a humbling perspective in this astronomical time frame, a reminder that even our most urgent catastrophes exist within cycles of change that extend far beyond a single human lifetime. This perspective doesn't absolve you of responsibility for this particular moment. Quite the opposite. It reminds you that your brief presence here carries meaning precisely because it is finite, because your choices matter within the time frame allocated to you. Morning arrives eventually, as it always does, regardless of whether we've slept well or spent the night wrestling with existential concerns. You move through your day carrying something different from the midnight reflection, not solutions to the world's immense problems, but a clarity about your relationship to them. The news cycle continues its relentless parade of crises, each headline competing for the limited resource of your attention and emotional energy. But today you notice the subtle manipulations more clearly, the way certain words are chosen to inflame rather than inform, the way complex situations are flattened into simplistic narratives of heroes and villains. But this awareness doesn't make you immune to concern, but it does create a small space between stimulus and response, between information and reaction. At work or in conversation with others, you notice how frequently responsibility is diffused and displaced. Someone should do something becomes the reflexive response to each new crisis, with that someone always implicitly defined as those with more power, more influence, more resources than ourselves. It's an understandable reflex. The scale of global challenges does indeed require systemic action by those with the greatest capacity to effect change. And yet, as you move through your day, you begin to recognize the subtle abduction of personal agency that occurs when all responsibility is projected outward. The paradoxical disempowerment that happens when we convince ourselves that meaningful action can only come from elsewhere. During lunch, you overhear colleagues discussing the latest environmental report, statistics about species loss, carbon thresholds, plastic accumulation in oceans. The conversation follows a familiar pattern, expressions of dismay, assertions that they need to fix things, followed by a resigned shrug and change of subject to weekend plans or office gossip. You understand this pattern intimately because you've participated in it countless times yourself. The collective helplessness, the momentary acknowledgement followed by strategic disconnection, these are entirely rational responses to overwhelming information. And yet today, something in you resists following this well-worn path from awareness to abdication. Instead, you find yourself considering what responsibility would look like if embraced rather than deflected. Not the crushing responsibility for solving global crises single-handedly, but the grounded responsibility for your own sphere of influence, however modest it might be. You think about the community garden you visited, the neighbor who collects rainwater, the local shop that eliminated single-use plastics despite the inconvenience and expense. None of these actions alone will reverse climate change or restore vanishing ecosystems, but collectively they represent something powerful, the refusal to surrender agency, the insistence on participating in solutions rather than merely lamenting problems. As afternoon unfolds, you make a small decision that would have seemed inconsequential before your midnight reflection. You research local environmental initiatives and commit to joining one that focuses on watershed protection. The commitment is modest, just a few hours monthly, but it represents a subtle yet significant shift in your relationship to the overwhelming challenges facing your world. You're no longer waiting for someone else to solve what troubles you. You're acknowledging that the scale of your action may not match the scale of your concern, but you're refusing to use that mismatch as justification for doing nothing at all. This shift extends beyond environmental concerns. When conversation turns to political polarization or economic inequality, you notice your own tendency to externalize responsibility, to focus exclusively on what politicians or corporations or institutions should do differently. Today, you gently challenge this reflex in yourself, asking what aspects of these complex issues intersect with your own daily choices and relationships. Not to assume burdens that rightfully belong to systems and structures far larger than yourself, but to identify where your own sphere of influence might contribute to either problem or solution, however incrementally. The evening news plays on your television or streams on your device, the familiar parade of global and local crises. But tonight, you notice something different about your response. The overwhelming flood of information that once left you feeling alternately enraged and paralyzed now meets a more centered awareness. You're neither numb to the genuine suffering being reported, nor swept away by the manufactured urgency that characterizes modern media. Instead, you've begun developing what philosophers might call a tragic consciousness, the capacity to remain fully aware of the world's profound brokenness without surrendering to either despair or denial. You turn off the news deliberately, earlier than usual, and spend time researching an issue that has particularly concerned you. Not the frantic scrolling through opinion pieces and hot takes that often masquerades as staying informed, but intentional learning about root causes and potential interventions. You seek out voices with direct experience of the issue, perspectives that challenge your assumptions, information that offers context rather than merely cultivating outrage. This deeper engagement requires more effort than passive consumption of headlines, but it leaves you feeling strangely energized rather than depleted, connected to possibilities rather than overwhelmed by problems. Before sleep, you open your journal and write about one specific action you took today that aligned with your values, something modest but meaningful within your actual sphere of influence. Perhaps you had a difficult conversation with genuine curiosity instead of defensive reactivity. Perhaps you made a consumption choice that reflected your concern for environmental impact. Perhaps you reached out to someone isolated by the very social fragmentation you've been lamenting. The action itself matters less than the intention behind it, the deliberate choice to participate in creating what you wish to see rather than merely criticizing what you don't. In bed, as sleep approaches, you realize something has shifted in your relationship to a world in crisis. You're no longer oscillating between frantic anxiety and numb detachment, between apocalyptic doom scrolling and strategic distraction. You've begun discovering a third path, one that acknowledges the gravity of what's unfolding without surrendering, your capacity to respond with integrity and intention. This path offers no guarantees about outcomes. The systems crumbling around us may continue their decline regardless of what individuals do. The climate may continue warming beyond critical thresholds. Political divisions may continue deepening. Economic inequalities may continue expanding. And yet, something essential changes when you reclaim your perception from those who profit from your panic, when you reclaim your agency from those who benefit from your paralysis. The world's trajectory may or may not be altered by your individual choices. That remains legitimately uncertain. But your experience of living through these challenging times transforms dramatically when you shift from passive witness to active participant, from helpless observer to intentional contributor. There is a profound difference between merely enduring history and consciously participating in its unfolding, between being acted upon by forces beyond your control and acting with integrity within the constraints of your actual influence. Days pass, each one bringing fresh evidence of systems straining and failing, each headline competing for the limited resource of your emotional energy. But something has fundamentally changed in how you meet these ongoing challenges. You've developed what resilience researchers call psychological flexibility, the capacity to remain engaged with difficult realities without becoming engulfed by them, to acknowledge legitimate fears without being paralyzed by them, to hold space for both the world's profound suffering and its persistent beauty. This flexibility isn't about positive thinking or denial of what's genuinely troubling. It's about developing the inner resources to respond rather than merely react, to participate rather than merely observe. This shift manifests in countless small ways throughout your days. You notice beauty more consistently, not as escape from reality, but as essential nourishment for continuing to face what's difficult. You engage in news consumption with greater intentionality, seeking understanding rather than outrage, context rather than mere content. You approach political conversations differently, listening for underlying values and concerns rather than merely defending positions. You make choices about time and energy with greater discernment, investing in relationships and activities that build resilience rather than those that merely distract from discomfort. Weeks unfold, the world's challenges continuing their complex evolution. Some days bring genuine progress, innovations that offer hope, movements gaining momentum, connections being forged across previous divides. Other days bring setbacks, environmental thresholds crossed, political systems further corrupted, economic hardships deepening. Through these fluctuations, you maintain what philosophers call tragic optimism, the capacity to remain oriented toward possibility without denying the reality of suffering, to work toward preferred futures without requiring certainty about outcomes. The small garden you've been tending, both literally in your neighborhood plot and metaphorically in your approach to engagement, begins showing signs of growth. Seeds planted weeks ago push through soil with green persistence. Relationships nurtured through intentional presence deepen in unexpected ways. Skills developed through consistent practice become more natural, requiring less conscious effort. None of these developments solve the world's immense challenges, but collectively they create a microcosm of what remains possible even as larger systems falter. A lived demonstration of resilience, connection, and regeneration operating at human scale. As months pass, you notice something surprising. The actions that once required deliberate effort, the intentional news consumption, the community engagement, the mindful choices about where to direct your limited resources of time and attention have gradually become habits integrated into your daily rhythms rather than existing as extraordinary interventions. What began as conscious resistance to hopelessness has evolved into a sustainable practice of engaged presence, neither frantic activism nor passive acceptance, but something more nuanced and enduring. This evolution doesn't mean you've become immune to discouragement or grief. Some mornings still begin with that heavy feeling in your chest as you absorb news of fresh disasters or depressing statistics. Some days still include moments of profound anger at systems that prioritize profit over well-being, power over justice, extraction over regeneration. Some nights still find you awake at that liminal hour, wrestling with uncertainty about the future your children or grandchildren might
inherit.
These emotional responses aren't failures of resilience. They're appropriate, human reactions to genuine threats and losses. The difference now is that these legitimate feelings no longer define your relationship to a world in crisis. They take their place within a larger capacity for response that includes not just grief and anger, but also wonder, gratitude, creativity, and determined action. You've developed what psychologists call response flexibility, the ability to match your response to what each situation genuinely requires rather than being limited to a narrow range of reactive patterns. This flexibility allows you to move fluidly between acknowledging what's being lost, celebrating what persists, and creating what wants to emerge. As the season changes, bringing its own reminder of nature's cycles of death and renewal, you reflect. On the journey from paralysis to participation, from overwhelm to engagement, the world remains as complex and challenging as ever, the headlines still reporting a mixed forecast of human folly and courage, destruction and creation, collapse and renewal. But your relationship to it all has fundamentally transformed. You've discovered, or perhaps remembered, that when the world is going to shit, the most radical response is neither blind optimism nor cynical detachment, but the stubborn insistence on remaining fully human, aware yet active, concerned yet creative, realistic yet undefeated. So I think you must be dreaming about all of this by now, so I'll just leave the fireplace burning to keep you warm and comfortable. Sleep well, knowing that even in a world that sometimes seems to be coming undone, you carry within you the capacity to weave something beautiful from whatever threads remain.